Greetings! This is Group Ruby with my next summary or review of an Asimov story. This one occurs in the November 1943 issue of Astounding. This, by the way, is the first issue of Astounding Science Fiction that appears in this new, smaller digest size, which it will continue to have for the rest of its existence. Not only is Astounding, but then later on as Analog. This is its size from now on. So, for all other robot stories, Foundation stories, and other stories, as far as this magazine is concerned, they're all digest size, which will also be the same for Galaxy magazine when that comes along, a magazine of fantasy and science fiction when that comes along, and several of the others, although there'll still be the occasional larger size magazine in rare occasions. But this begins a very long sequence right here also, in which everything he writes goes to the pages of Astounding Science Fiction. And so most of what he does is robots and Foundation stories, but there's a few other stories that I'll intermix with all of these. But all of them will be covered in sequence. So in this particular case, the story is one titled "Not Final." Now, when they went to the digest size, something mildly interesting happened here. Okay, that is that though his name and story appears in the table of content, death sentence. Where is this? Oh. Death sentence. There are no more squibs. Apparently, that kind of fell out of fashion, so it just says Death Sentence by Isaac Asimov, page 32. So that's all we have. The text basically seems to be the same as it's got republished in the early Asimov, with a couple exceptions where for some reason it has the albino Theolo Rialo or something like that. Anyway, that guy had spent 25 years on this planet, but in a couple places originally for some misprint reason it said 5 years. I don't know. So they corrected that to 25 years so to be consistent. He spent 25 years on this planet. Now, this is kind of an unusual story. Strictly speaking, it could be considered a robot story. What's not clear is what these robots came from and what they represent. So, I'm kind of at a loss to know just where this is trying to take place. Because the big twist at the end is basically that there's this whole planet populated by these robots, apparently as some 15,000-year-old science experiment by some previous galactic civilization, which practically nothing else is known. But these robots they had continued on as an experiment long past the collapse of that civilization. But what were these robots? They're kind of human-like. Our beings in here describe themselves as humans. Whether they're humans in a literal, conventional human sense as we know it, or maybe humans in the sense of the Galactic Federation. And I'm inclined to kind of tie this very loosely in the Galactic Federation series with Homo Sol and Homo Sol and what's the next one? Not fine. No, that's not the one. Gosh, it's out of my brain. The Imaginary, the Hazing. That's it. Homo Sol, the Imaginary, and the Hazing. The main thing I see in common is Arcturus University, which appears in those stories as well. All of them, as far as I can tell. Tanporus is at Arcturus University, where he's experimenting unsuccessfully with a squid in the Homo Sol. In the imaginary, he has succeeded in experimenting with that squid, but then the other lab assistants do some other thing to the squid that creates a disaster for the whole university and apparently a very dangerous expanding problem. And then the hazing, of course, features some students of Arcturus University who decide to put through some new students, newly admitted as freshmen, who happen to be literal humans from the newly admitted planet Earth, through a very serious hazing. And now we have, again, Arcturus University, but now none of our familiar figures, and even the whole situation seems different. They're calling themselves humans. I don't know. This is supposed to be maybe it's a later civilization. Maybe this is the galactic civilization after many more years of breeding out a lot of the things that made the different kinds of humanoid species different as they existed before. And anyway, so they find this planet full of these robots left over from some previous civilization. Well, this one guy in particular had spent 25 years on there. And, well, there are a couple pieces of artwork associated with it. I might as well what we have on the title page. We have this picture of what looks like just an ordinary man sitting there smoking his cigarette with a cigarette holder, and over his head a skull. It's kind of like a death sentence waiting for him. And the little squib here, by the way, it's illustrated by FAX, facts. Okay. Whoever that is. So the little squib reads, our psychologists of today have set up colonies of monkeys and other animals as experiments. On a larger scale, with larger means, a greater experiment could be undertaken. Yeah, a whole planet of humanoid beings that are made as, note this, positronic robots. So one has to kind of wonder how this story isn't in the rest of the robots. We do have a couple of characters, and one is kind of having a bit of a discussion. I think one of them is named Lion Murray. And there's another one who's just kind of the head of the board of some sort of board of people who make decisions about what kind of research will be funded and stuff like that. And they're having kind of a discussion there. Maybe, that could be the albino. I'm not sure. It's a discussion. So you have a couple pieces of artwork. Other than that, and I mentioned the other difference that was just a typo in the original that they fixed. 25 years for 5. And other than that, you can get the story. Now, in the early Asimov. Now, they're talking about this robot world. They're wondering what to make of it. And apparently these robots had contentedly gone along on their own, an experiment long abandoned by whatever race started it and died off, and they just kept going on like a civilization for however long. I don't know how they know it's 15,000 years, but okay, we'll just push that aside and accept that. The problem is, next thing is, while the albino was there, and maybe there's some other visitations, these robots have come to realize there are other worlds out there. They're in this obscure planet, kind of where there's not away from the trade routes and everything of the galaxy, so they shouldn't readily be found. But they had been found, and now this guy had spent all this time there, and he's reporting what he found. And I guess these robots are rather simple-minded and have a lot of capability, especially technical capability. That being the case, they might possibly go out into space and maybe even become hostile. A little bit of a Frankenstein complex, I think. And they actually decide they're going to try to destroy the robot world before they can actually do that. The one guy, though, wants to race back to them and, I don't know, help them in some vague way. Or die with them. I don't know the specifics. The only real big deal or surprise at the end the main city on this world is called New York. Now, are we saying that's Earth? We're these robots? Well, that kind of conflicts with the other story about these Homo Sol and other stories set with Arcturus University and so forth, wherein Earth was a specific identifiable world that justified its existence by getting to another star, interstellar travel, and now that suddenly made them somebody important enough to be worth trying to find a way to incorporate into their civilization, despite the fact we're kind of wild and crazy and ambitious and different. It could be a world named after ours or made by ours. All of this is unclear. And in fact, it probably suffers more than most of the stories from being a lot of wordy discussions. We never actually see the planet. There's talk of people visiting. The one guy had spent 25 years there, and he says a little bit about it, and especially the robots that inhabit it. But on the whole, it's just people talking about this thing and then making some decision about it. I'm sorry, I don't find it a terribly interesting story, and I don't know anybody who ever did. One can see why this would not be gathered up in any of its more usual collections. The early Asimov, there it is for the completist, but I would rate this story rather low. And like I said, its connection to the Homo Sol imaginary Hazing series is extremely tenuous at best. Although it does kind of bring in these robots. It even claims they're positronic. Apparently the humans who were at Arcturus University and having all these discussions also have some sort of robots among themselves, not as sophisticated even as the ones on this planet. Nothing about the 3 laws of robotics. So it's kind of borderline whether this counts as a robotic story or not. So, it is what it is, and hopefully most of the next stories will be a whole lot more interesting. Well, thank you for hearing about this particular story with me.